The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Two things we always need, but perhaps more acutely in these times than usual: hope and perspective. Nobel Prize-winning author Kazuo Ishiguro fills the pages of his new novel with such insight. He joins us tonight for a feature interview on finding his way from artificial intelligence to the essence of the human heart. Then, if your eyes glaze over at the phrase board of directors, we've got a conversation about why what they do matters and why they need an overhaul. It's Wednesday, March the 10th, and that's tonight on The Agenda. It can be a fool's errand to try to characterize the writing of an author whose work has been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. But in the case of novelist Kazuo Ishiguro, one might easily say, still waters run deep. Whether in his earlier work, such as The Remains of the Day, or more recently, The Buried Giant, among his many gifts to readers is finding the quiet, profound markings of life and capturing them in story. Kazuo Ishiguro is author of 8 books, including his new novel, Clara and the Sun. And he joins us now from London, UK. It is so good to see you and have you back on this program. I guess we should say that since you were last here several years ago, I don't know, what's changed in your life? Oh yeah, you won the Nobel Prize, which is not bad at all. And in fact, we're going to bring a picture up here just to set up the first question, which is, so has your life changed much since you won the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, that picture is taken in my back garden. And literally about an hour before that scene, I had no idea I'd won the Nobel Prize. You know, I don't know if you can see it in the photograph. I haven't washed my hair. You know, I was just sitting at the kitchen table, having a late breakfast, and then I got a couple of phone calls, and then all these guys were at my door. You know, far more. I mean, you can't even see how many news people turned up. Complete shock. No, it was a fantastic experience. It's a great honor. But I have to tell you, I mean, it feels to me now like it's something that happened to somebody else. You know. And my writing life hasn't changed. My personal life hasn't much changed. You know, it's like it happened in a parallel universe, and there's this avatar that went around receiving these things and giving acceptance speeches, and then there's me here. My study is just as untidy as ever, and all my problems as a writer, all the difficulties that were sitting there on my desk were there in a kind of Marie Celeste kind of way. It's still there, and that's kind of how it's been.
So in a way, everything changes, but in another way, nothing changes. Is that right?
Yeah. I don't want to belittle it. You know, I think it's a tremendous honor. And I kind of feel it's I've accepted the honor on behalf of my generation of writers, not just on behalf of British writers, but writers of my generation. And I think it's great that writing has been put up there alongside the sciences and economics, and peace as something worthy of a Nobel Prize. So I'm kind of pleased to win it on behalf of the literary community.
Wonderful. Let's talk about your new book, Clara and the Sun, which I tell you, I read in one sitting and is just, I mean, this is a lovely, lovely, wonderful story. And I guess one of the things that I found so intriguing about it was you really don't tell us what this story's about until about page 46. And I don't want to give away too much, obviously, as we have this conversation. But this notion of a person shopping for an AF, and we don't find out what the AF is until page 46. So I guess let's start here. Where did the idea of shopping for an artificial friend, where did this all come from?
Well, that idea isn't that new. I mean, I think in some parts of the world, there are artificial intelligence companions, particularly for elderly people, already being marketed. I think there are some in Japan and also in the United States. So that's not my idea, but I was imagining a world in which I invented that term AF. The AFs are more or less ubiquitous. They don't cause consternation if they're seen in the street. I mean, they're like bicycles or refrigerators. People have them in this world, and they're principally creatures, sweet creatures, that are designed to prevent teenagers from becoming lonely. And so the novel begins with Clara in a store. She's just been kind of created, I guess, so she knows nothing. She's looking at the human world and learning about it at an exponential rate by looking out of the window, and she's hoping that some nice teenager will come and buy her. So that's how it starts.
It's interesting that you say, I imagined a world or I created a world, because as I tried to figure out where this story is actually set, I'm not sure I figured it out. So do you want to tell us where and when this place is?
Well, geographically, it's probably the United States, because, they have sidewalks rather than pavements and so on, So I put it down somewhere in the United States, but it's not that important, in the literal sense where it's set. But I kind of felt it's appropriate to the United States. I wanted it to be in the United States because for a lot of the kind of images that I wanted to put in that book, I had a lot of those I had a lot of Americana images, the paintings of Edward Hopper or Grant Wood, from these kind of paintings from the 1930s, both of kind of rural landscapes with big skies and open fields and a kind of a grain silo on the horizon, that kind of thing, and also these cityscapes with the sun, shafts of the sun coming down between tall buildings. I had a lot of those images in my head, so I kind of liked the idea that it was some kind of slightly futuristic America, or maybe like an alternative version of America today. And also, America is a very young society, as I think we've been reminded forcefully in the last few months. And this is a society in great flux, because advances in science and technology are bringing enormous changes to the way it's organized.
You do ask some fascinating questions about how well we can know what's in people's hearts, and actually not only people's hearts, but the hearts of artificial friends as well. And let's just pluck a little excerpt from the book here as I set up this next question. Then let me ask you something else you write. Let me ask you this. Do you believe in the human heart? I don't simply mean the organ, obviously. I'm speaking in the poetic sense. The human heart. Do you think there is such a thing? Something that makes each of us special and individual? And you I guess, posit the notion that there is, even in artificial intelligence, the possibility of true heart being there. Can you help us understand what you were driving at here?
Yeah, well, that quote comes from the mouth of one of the characters, and that's a question that's actually addressed to the narrator, Clara, this little artificial intelligence girl, who by this point has learnt a huge amount about the human world, because she picks things up, and she's very fast. And she's now living outside of that shop. She's living with a family, and she's trying to save that family from heartbreak, And I guess, yeah, at a certain point, she's asked by one of the members of the family, what she's being asked there really is, a super intelligent machine like you, a piece of artificial intelligence, can you actually learn a human being fully to the point where you might actually be able to replace them if the unthinkable thing happens and that person dies? Have you got the ability to actually learn so much about a person that you're living side by side with every day of your life that you'll be able to more or less, replicate her in kind of a way? A digital copy is not really a digital copy at all. It's exactly the same as the thing it's copied from. So that's kind of what's behind that question in that scene. And the questioner is basically asking, isn't there something about human beings that makes each individual so unique and special that even an incredibly observant machine like you will never be able to penetrate that core of a human individual, and that will remain unique. And if we lose it, we have the right to mourn its passing, and we'll feel its loss, and it will never be replaced. I guess that's what's behind that conversation.
We'd like to think that there is something so utterly unique about us that there's only one of us in the entire universe and couldn't possibly be replicated. You are positing with us the notion that we maybe ought not to be that cocky about our uniqueness. Were you as uncomfortable writing this as I was reading it?
Yes. I mean, and I suppose, I try to address that, or at least Clara tries to address it, in the final passages of the book. But it is a notion that I feel is creeping up on us. I think for centuries and centuries, we human beings, we've even long after many of us have stopped believing in God in the old-fashioned way, or a relationship between our soul and God in the classic kind of religious sense. Long after we've kind of stopped believing that in any literal way, we have held on to this idea that there is some kind of a soul or something unique, some invisible ghost, that occupies our bodies. And it's because of that it makes sense when I say something like, I love my wife, or I love my daughter. There's something actually unique about my wife and my daughter that makes love in that human context something meaningful. Now, because we live in a world where big data, algorithms, and artificial intelligence is becoming more and more every day. And every time we go shopping online, or we try and download a movie or something, we get people predicting what we'd want to see next week, and what we might want to shop for next week. I mean, possibly I'm saying that we might be getting to a point where we start to actually question a lot of these assumptions on which we've organized family life, and I have to say, in the larger sense, our societies, around the notion that the individual is a sacrosanct unit upon which we have to build all our political systems. We might start to be tempted to think, actually, we're not that complex or unique. We're a bunch of algorithms. And this is some sort of superstition from the past that we're hanging on to. So that's the idea that's being interrogated, I guess, by the characters in this book, not in an intellectual way, but in an emotional way, because we have a situation in this family where the daughter is pretty sick, and I guess the mother is trying to preempt, an utter sense of loss and bereavement, and is wondering if this is some way out of it.
One of the really fascinating choices you made in writing this book, and obviously, I mean, you're a man in your 60s, so I'm not saying that every book you write has to be narrated by a man in his 60s, but you are narrating this book as an artificial intelligence young girl. And I wonder how tricky that is for you, since that's not who you are.
But I've never narrated from people who are like me. When I was a young writer, my first novel I wrote in my 20s. The novel that was mentioned in the introduction, The Remains of the Day, I wrote in my early 30s. The narrators were always elderly people looking back on their lives. I've always found it easier to write from the perspective of characters who are not like me. And I've always been drawn to writing from the point of view of outsiders, people who are slightly outside the society, or in this case, outside of the human race, because it provides these kind of tremendous focusing opportunities. If you've got somebody strange like Clara, she's almost like an alien. It's very natural for her to ask these questions, which other contexts might seem rather over philosophical or even pretentious. It's very natural for this naive, sweet machine type girl to ask questions like, why do human beings have loneliness? Yeah, are they fundamentally lonely? I mean, she asks this question because she's created to prevent teenagers from becoming lonely. So she tends to see everything through the lens of loneliness, even when she's looking out at the street and trying to learn about the human world beyond her shop. She's looking at it in terms of loneliness. Are they behaving like that to avoid loneliness? And of course, later she starts to, when she learns more, it's natural for her to ask these questions like, what do human beings mean when they say the word love? And that big question, so what makes a human being unique? Is there something special about each individual human being or not? Okay, I'm a 66-year-old guy, and Clara seems to be this kind of machine girl, but that's another thing. That's another kind of opportunity you have if you have an AI narrator. I thought I could combine just in this one character many parts of many stages of the kind of typical human lifespan, and often at the one and the same time. Some aspects of her remain like a small child, and she has kind of small child's logic, the kind of naivety and kind of drawing weird conclusions from the very limited evidence she has, while at the same time she's become very super sophisticated about learning about other aspects of human beings. And so I think she goes through being like a baby to being like a teenager to being like a mother. I think a lot of the time, she has a strong parental urge, and towards the end of the book, she's like an elderly person who's been discarded by the very people she's cared for and no longer has a function. And her role is, the only thing that remains to her is to look back and ask herself, did she do her work well?
Now, I do need to ask you about the housekeeper, because the housekeeper in your book, who's clearly an immigrant, by the way you have her speaking, English clearly her second language, and her name is Melania. Now, would you be trying to draw attention to anybody in particular by naming this immigrant Melania?
No, that's just coincidence.
Come on.
It honestly is. When I was writing that book, I actually thought, it did occur to me, but I thought by the time this book comes out, both the president, the then current president, and his wife will no longer be so much in the public eye. I made that prediction, and I was correct. It's a very common name from Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. So, and it doesn't pin her down to any one country or ethnicity. So I thought, I mean, she's a slightly comic character, so I thought it's a relatively safe name. I'm not going to get trolled by people from one particular nation somewhere if I use that name.
Although your Melania sure loves the F-bomb.
Well, I guess so. Yeah, but I mean, that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. The last time you were on this program, you talked to another one of our hosts, Pia Chattopadhyay, who interviewed you then, and you were talking about writing and storytelling, and there was a nugget in that conversation that I thought particularly fascinating that I wanted to follow up on. And let's just play a short snippet from that interview, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, the clip.
If we want to keep up a serious storytelling tradition, I think it's very important as a culture that we do, whatever form, whatever medium that we choose. I mean, the stories have to be genuine. They're not just audience manipulation vehicles. They have to actually reveal proper truths in some kind of way for people to really value them as something more than just entertainment that passes the time.
First of all, you've barely aged a day, so congratulations on that. That's 6 years ago. But second of all, that expression, proper truth, and how your work is obliged to reveal some kind of proper truth, I found most interesting. What proper truth do you think Clara and the Sun reveals?
Well, what I mean by proper truth there, I mean, it's not something that can kind of be fact-checked. I guess, I mean, and it's not for me to say. It's not for me to say whether Clara and the Sun contains an authentic truth. I'm talking about some kind of emotional truth. I'm presenting in the book. Overall, I'm presenting a certain vision, a set of feelings about human experience that are mine, and I'm putting them out there, and I'm asking readers, do you feel this too? Or is it just me? Am I weird, or do you understand what I'm getting at here? at that emotional level? Does this chime in with what you think about human life? And when I'm talking, 6 years ago, and I must say I looked very solemn. Maybe I used to be very solemn in those days. but I think what I was getting at then was that we have to be able to recognize the difference between sentimentality and emotional manipulation as it exists in stories, whether it's fiction or movies. Which means that we should always take a step back, even if it's something that's actually really involving us, making us cry, making us laugh. We should take a step back and ask, well, all right, is this just something that, all right, the journey is quite interesting and fun, but it doesn't have a great deal to do with real life? Or do we say that it's not just that it moves us at that superficial level, it actually is a reflection of what I feel about life and how life is. Now, I think this is very important now. I think in those intervening years, I think we've seen what you might roughly call this era of post-truth become very large, and it seems to, right now we in the country neighboring yours, and if I'm reading this correctly, about half of the people who live in it think that Donald Trump actually won the election, and it doesn't really matter that there is no evidence, because what matters is what you feel. And if you feel that Donald Trump won the election, then you're allowed to hold that belief as the truth. Now, what's very interesting in the era of the pandemic, it seems to me, is that we have that kind of notion that's been growing stronger and stronger. The disregard for evidence has run straight into an emergency situation where we rely absolutely and desperately on the scientific method, something that relies absolutely on rigor and evidence. And I know that in the world of science, my father was a scientist, and I've been privileged to meet a lot of leading scientists. They have a kind of a rigor that perhaps doesn't exist in the world of writing. They challenge each other with evidence. And when the argument seems to be won, you just concede. You say, yes, you're right, I was wrong. Let's move on. Now we can actually take the next step towards the truth. There's an assumption that there is a truth to be discovered. And it's interesting that we've had this collision of these two ways of looking at the world. And they seem to have reached an extreme in this past year. And there is a part of me that is concerned that because my job, what I do is I write these books that essentially do things to people emotionally. I have actually asked this question: have I been contributing to this era of post-truth? This idea that all that matters is what you feel. Basically, the truth equals what you want to believe, and as long as you kind of feel it deeply enough, you have the right to continue to believe it. I mean, am I contributing to that by producing novels that I claim, contain some sort of emotional truth that is beyond verification by science or fact-checking? And so, I don't know, it's very interesting when you played that clip to me. Back then, these things weren't really in my mind, but I would say the same thing again. I think it's more important than ever that, well, indeed, people such as yourself, Steve, and readers and critics, that they learn to exercise a sharp critical judgment and ask themselves, when they're being entertained, when they're being moved, when they're being made to cry or laugh, what's behind it? Is there some actual hard truth? Does this bear up to scrutiny when you put it alongside what you really feel to be your own experience and vision of the world? I think we do need scrutiny now in the arts world, just as we do in the world of science. You can't just go along just making things up and claiming, it's true.
Well, I don't know if I get a vote on this, but I would vote no. You are not contributing to a kind of a post-truth world where only feelings matter and empirically provable facts don't matter, I would say, no, you're not contributing to that. In fact, quite the contrary. You are giving us some utterly profound things to think about in a beautiful way, which we perhaps have not thought about before. And I know one of the questions that came to my mind after I read the book was, you know, the artificial friends in your book are not always very well treated by their human minders. And I wondered whether you foresaw a future where not only are people going to need a Bill of Rights, or a Charter of Rights as we have here in Canada, but whether artificial intelligence friends are also going to need some kind of Charter of Rights because their rights are not respected in a way that ours are currently. Can I get you to weigh in on that?
To be frank, Steve, I mean, that's not one of the things that concerns me about artificial intelligence. You know, but yes, I've often heard people say that. You know, that I mean, once we get to a point where we think that machines are sensitive, have emotions, then we do have to extend some rights. I think there are some very big challenges about artificial intelligence and gene editing that are upon us right now. You know, because I think these fields, there's been huge advances in both of these fields, and we haven't really woken up to them as a society. That's my feeling. You know, and I don't. You know, for a start, I'm not one of those people who worries that, you know, robots will take over the world and we'll all become chained slaves. You know, I'm not worried about that. And to be honest, maybe I should be, but I'm not that concerned about, you know, about Android rights either. You know, I'm more concerned about. I think the more urgent questions about AI would be to do with the fact that perhaps the majority of people will soon be out of work. And that system that we used to have for centuries that assumed that most people will be able to work and earn a living, and that's how they'll get on with their private lives. I mean, that system might have to be rethought entirely. You know, and also I would worry. My area of worry about artificial intelligence is that it's a way of, you know, baking in, hardwiring our prejudices and our biases of our current age. And we won't be able to get it out of the black box because we don't quite know, you know, how the conclusions are being reached, how the recommendations and advice that comes out of artificial intelligence is being produced. And we won't be able to unpack them in the way that we've been able to unpack decisions of the past, like, you know, slavery or, you know, sexism or racism. You know, we've moved on and we've been able to say, look, we've got to redo that. But I think it's going to be more difficult to do with artificial intelligence recommending big things to us. And my third area of worry is that artificial intelligence will actually take away the advantage, the leading edge that liberal democracies had over authoritarian, centrally planned societies in the past, which enabled, I would say, you know, the open societies to win that Cold War battle.
Well, all of those concerns that you put on the record notwithstanding, you have made the hero of your book a rather selfless artificial intelligence friend. Again, I'm not going to give away the plot here, but your AF is a hero. So you may be concerned about all of those things, but to me, that's not the big story you just told.
No, I just raised that because, I mean, you raised the possible issues that might face us, but I'm also excited by AI. You know, and indeed with gene editing. I think they will bring us enormous benefits, particularly in medical science, but in many other respects as well, in feeding the world. I'm just hoping, but it's like any tool. It's up to us to actually figure out how we use it. You know, do we use it to try and reduce the inequalities that have been developing at an incredible rate over the last decades, or do we allow it to increase the inequality levels within societies and between countries? You know, but Clara for me is an optimistic figure. She's full of hope, and she never lets go of hope because of her relationship with the sun. I mean, this is something we haven't talked about. The story is called Clara and the Sun. And she has an almost like religious-like belief in the sun, because she's solar powered, I suppose, as the source of kindness and goodness, and as a kind of a being that she can appeal to come to the rescue. And she never loses her faith in the sun, and that she's able to remain hopeful. And of course, I think Clara is also kind of a mirror reflection of human beings. I mean, she goes out there, she absorbs all this information about human behavior, she takes it on. And so she's a kind of she's a distorted, refracted, funny reflection, a kind of strange little mirror of human behavior, but she is made up of human behavior. And I think I'm trying in this book as a kind of a reply to an earlier book of mine, Never Let Me Go, which I think, looking back now over the years, seems to me a very sad book, a very bleak book. I think I wanted to reply to my own book with something more hopeful and optimistic.
Mission accomplished. You know, I could talk to you all day, but I got a feeling you got other more pressing things to get to. So I'm going to thank you very much for being on TVO with us tonight to talk about Clara and the Sun. Kazuo Ishiguro, it's been a great pleasure getting to meet and talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been fantastic to talk to you, Steve. Thank you very much.
In the mid-1990s, corporate Canada adopted a new set of guidelines to inform the structure of their boards of directors. That happened because many felt companies hadn't responded adequately to the crises they'd faced up to that point. A quarter century on, and amid mounting emergencies such as COVID-19, climate change, inequality, racism, and ongoing gender gaps, is another overhaul needed. Let's explore that with, in Boston, Massachusetts, Veena Ramani. She is Senior Program Director, Capital Market Systems at Ceres. And there's Sarah Kaplan. She's Director at the Institute for Gender and the Economy and a professor at the U of T's Rotman School of Management. Her most recent book is The 360-Degree Corporation: From Stakeholder Trade-Offs to Transformation. And it's good to have both of you on the agenda tonight. Sarah, by way of background, you wrote this report called Where Are the Directors in a World in Crisis? Let's just start, let's set the table for our discussion to come with that. Why did you write the report in the first place?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, there's been guidelines that were launched a number of years ago, and time has passed and the world has changed. And we are now at a moment, as the title of the report says, where the world is in crisis for the reasons you mentioned, existential crisis because of climate change and other things. And so I got together with Peter Day, who was the original writer of governance guidelines in 1994, and suggested 25, now 26, 27 years later, we really needed to revisit those for a new set of realities. And I think it's also because of COVID, there's been some increased awareness of the important role that the corporation can play in society and must play in society.
But the inference I draw from that title is that wherever they are, you think they're not doing what they ought to be doing. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think so, in the sense that I think that Canada has come up to speed on the governance standards of the 20th century, but really now we have 21st century challenges, and there are a number of things that members of boards of directors really need to be aware of, take on board, address, and deal with that involve all the stakeholders that surround them. And there are some good examples of boards that are doing this, but many, many in Canada are not yet up to speed.
We will get into that. Veena, you were on the advisory panel, I gather, for this report. What role did you play?
I work for an organization called Ceres, Steve, here in the US. And Ceres works with large companies and large investors on large sustainability issues like climate change. And one of the reasons that we focus on the role of the board is because at the end of the day, we want companies to take robust and ambitious action that addresses these, as Sarah put it, existential crises for the business and financial risks they are. And corporate boards, with their role at the top of the organizational structure and their ability to really hire, fire, and incentivize management, we think play an extraordinarily important role in making sure that companies adopt their business strategies to make them resilient in the face of these environmental and social challenges.
I don't know if it's possible to say, generally speaking, are they playing that robust role that you want them to play? But can you sort of comment on whether, generally speaking, they are?
I mean, I'm going to say, generally speaking, we're not quite sure because there isn't a significant line of sight into what boards do and what they don't. But here's what the data does show us, right? So last year, PwC did a survey of US corporate directors and found that just 38% of them recognize that environmental and social issues pose financial risk. They are starting to recognize that investors want them to play an increasingly assertive role in issues like climate change. So I take some small comfort from that. But here's another really depressing data point. Just earlier this year, there was a study that came out of NYU, the Stern School of Business, that looked at the backgrounds of the corporate directors on the boards of the Fortune 100, some of the largest companies in the world, and found that less than 5% had demonstrable fluency in material, environmental, and social issues to their business, right? So if you take those two data points together, you take the fact that most corporate directors still don't understand the financial and business relevance of environmental and social crises to their business. And also they just don't have the fluency to be able to engage on these issues in a robust, informed, and thoughtful manner. And that leads to a state of affairs that I have to say depresses me a little bit.
Okay, in which case, Sarah, let's really go back to first principles here. We're going to go like Rotman 101 in terms of business class right now. Boards of directors, what in fact is their mission with a company?
Well, the boards of directors have a legal responsibility to represent the shareholders in the governance of the corporation. They hire and fire the CEO. They set the compensation and executive packages for not just the CEO, but the executive leadership. And they also offer guidance and make final decisions on very important things that the company does that have to do with risks, that have to do with acquisitions, that have to do with major strategic moves. And they are meant to be the oversight of the company to make sure that the company is executing on its duty, which is to the duty to the corporation. And so the board of directors, they don't run the company, but they provide a lot of oversight and final okay on key decisions that are going to have an impact on the company and the company's impact on the world.
But let me ask you about power, because boards of directors tend to be part-time people, whereas the CEO is a very full-time job. So who's really got the power in that relationship?
Well, this has been a subject of very long debate and a contention, and part of prior governance reforms, in fact, the ones that Peter Day had recommended, 25 years ago or more, was to split the role of the chair of the board from the CEO. And, there had been a long tradition where the person who chaired the board was the CEO, and that splitting up of the CEO and the chair of the board was meant to kind of right the balance between these two players and make sure that the board had its separate and independent oversight, that the board wasn't filled with executives who were simply rubber stamping what the executives wanted, but played an actual counterpart to the things that the executive do. And the other way that they have influence is, of course, they set the compensation package. So they are basically telling the CEO and the senior leadership, you're only going to make your bonus or you're only going to get your raise if you are actually executing on these goals that we have set for you.
Well, that leads to the next question, Veena, which is, how do you get to be on a board? How do you get chosen?
Well, board members are typically chosen because they know other people on boards. And that's a big part of the problem that we find ourselves with. Because as of now, corporate boards are populated by people who look a very particular way. They tend to be Caucasian, they tend to be older, they tend to be male. And when, these existing corporate directors go to their networks to pick the new member on their board, to recommend members for other boards, they tend to pick people who look like them. So you end up with a situation where of extraordinary homogeneity in corporate boards, which is why you are starting to see a strong focus by the investor community calling for more diversity on corporate boards, both in terms of getting more women on corporate boards as well as getting more people of color, a broader ethnic makeup. And that is supported by the research. There's research that shows that boards that are more diverse are actually oversee companies that outperform their peers on a range of financial metrics.
I would be most interested in your response to the not too long ago incident that took place when a major corporate leader in the United States said, look, I'd love to put more women on my board, but I couldn't find any qualified women to put on the board. What's your take on that?
Well, as you can imagine, my take is he isn't looking hard enough. Because the reality is that there are an extraordinary complement of extremely qualified women who sit on the management level of several large enterprises. But this is a part of the problem, right? If corporate boards, if CEOs are looking to a very specific skill set in populating corporate boards, it means that they're looking at a very narrow sample set in terms of the pool of directors that they could look to. But again, what investors are looking for corporate boards to do is be diverse, certainly in terms of gender and ethnicity, but also in terms of the kinds of backgrounds and skills that they could have represented on corporate boards, which is, again, a great way to certainly bring on and pull from the immense and talented pool of women, as well as people of different ethnicities who could play, I think, an extraordinary role on corporate boards.
Now, Sarah, if we've heard it once, we've heard it 1,000 times. The role of the board is to maximize shareholder value. Period. Full stop. Do you think that's right?
It's actually not right, and it's not even the legal responsibility in the Canadian context. The role of the board is to take care of the corporation, and can consider a full range of stakeholders, one of which are the shareholders, but that is not the only person or group of people that you care about. And this is in a little bit contrast between the U.S. setup and the Canadian setup, because in Canada, certainly since the BCE Supreme Court decision in 2008, which actually said that, the board did not only have a responsibility to the shareholders, and in fact did have a responsibility to consider other stakeholders. We have a legal framework in Canada that basically says the statement that you just made is incorrect. Yet we often hear this statement because, one, it's more predominant in the United States, and the United States kind of governance structure seems to have a shadow over what we consider in Canada. But in Canada, we actually don't have that legal framework. So to say that is actually incorrect from even a legal standpoint. And now when we consider all of the different kinds of risks that Veena is talking about, all of the different pressures on the company, even if that were the case, you would still have to pay attention to all of these other stakeholders if you were going to be exerting good governance.
Veena, maybe I can get you to follow up on that.
Yeah, and I was going to, so thank you, Steve. I will say that even in the US, the investor community is starting to recognize that any sort of company that doesn't pay attention to the interests and needs of its critical stakeholder groups isn't a company that's governing itself well. And this stands to reason, right? We see this right now with the coronavirus pandemic. Any company that isn't taking care of and investing in its workforce, in its employees, in its talent pool, is a company that's not managing its core assets really well. So any sort of shareholder value, the primacy of the shareholder value approach that doesn't take into account the impacts of stakeholder groups on corporate performance is investors who aren't thinking in their own best interest.
Now, you used an expression there that, Sarah, again, we're going Rotman 101 here. We're going to bring it right down to brass tacks. Stakeholder groups. For a major corporation, what does that include?
Yes, and stakeholder is a word that sounds kind of jargony, and maybe people don't always understand exactly what it means. But what we're talking about is any group or people who are either impacted by or have an impact on the company. So that could include some internal stakeholders such as employees, but we're also talking about people who are concerned with the environment. We're talking about the general communities. We're talking about issues around inequality. We're talking about people in the supply chain. All of these issues are potentially related to how the company operates, how the company has an impact on society or people or groups that could have an impact on the company. Climate change is going to have a massive impact on every single company, either in terms of creating many, many risks, many disruptions. The increase in disruptions in operations caused by climate incidents is going up. These are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about considering all of the different stakeholders.
Well, Veena, let me just for argument's sake, I'll play devil's advocate here. Let's take any corporate. Let's take McDonald's. Okay, McDonald's. Their stakeholders are their employees, their customers who eat their burgers. I mean, you could say that's it. Tell us why you think McDonald's ought to be equally as concerned with racial diversity, Black Lives Matter, climate change, gender parity, all of that kind of stuff.
because these affect the company and the stakeholders that they work with. So, for instance, you talked about racial equality, and you talked about the McDonald's employees and McDonald's customers being the key stakeholder groups that they care about. Well, these constituencies, McDonald's employees, McDonald's customers, tend to be mixed from an ethnicity perspective. So clearly, an organization that isn't keeping what's the very important discussions that are happening in the US about systemic racism into account is not thinking about how these critical stakeholder groups are being affected by these issues and what that effect means in terms of their interaction with the companies in question. So companies don't operate in a vacuum, Steve. Companies operate within the context of the communities in which they are situated, within the context of the employees that they engage with on a day-to-day basis, and within the context of the customers who essentially provide them with a reason to exist. So to divorce the issues that affect these constituencies from the way that the company operates is just bad business practice.
Well, okay, Sarah, put us in the boardroom. And again, let's, just for argument's sake, let's take McDonald's. Let's say there's a McDonald's board of directors meeting, and they've got, a bunch of competing interests that they've got to resolve at a board of directors meeting. They got to make sure that their hamburgers taste great and are cheap. They got to make sure their customers are satisfied. They got to make sure their suppliers are, they've got a good relationship with them. They've got to make, anyway, the list. It's all long. But now there is this other list of concerns as well that Veena has just expressed. Okay, how does the McDonald's board figure all of that out?
Well, that's, I think, the million or billion dollar question that you've raised. These interests that we're talking about, and even with McDonald's, we could talk about climate change and the ways that, as one of the largest consumers of beef, and how the whole meat system is actually creating, major environmental damage and climate change. That, all of these issues have to be considered, and there is not an easy answer to that. What we are telling boards, and what I think is so important, is that boards need to recognize all of these issues, recognize how the movement towards Black Lives Matter matters for how they think about their employees, the advancement of their employees, the opportunities that they give, how environmental change is going to affect the disruption on their store operations or their impact on the environment. And they have to have all of those on the table. And then they have to have some kind of process they have to develop for themselves. And every company will have to do this in their own way, a process for thinking through and resolving these kinds of trade-offs that you highlight, because often there will be trade-offs. And what we have in the Canadian context is a duty to make sure that each of the stakeholders feels at least that they were treated fairly in that decision-making process, knowing that maybe not everyone can win in every single decision that is made. But we have something called the oppression remedy, which means that legally stakeholders can actually take a company to court with the leave of the court if they feel that they have not been fairly treated. And so the companies and boards have to develop some kind of process that will withstand that scrutiny.
Steve, can I jump in on this point as well?
Please.
Great. So I'm going to say that companies actually have really great systems in place to address risk, especially large companies, right? They have extraordinarily large, extraordinarily complex enterprise risk management systems. The problem that happens is the lack of recognition of environmental and social issues like climate change, as Sarah pointed out, issues like systemic inequality, systemic racism, workplace issues. The problem is they don't recognize that these issues are business risks as well, and they don't run them through their enterprise risk management systems. And at the end of the day, data out is only as good as data in, right? Where companies are able to recognize the financial impacts of these issues, run the analytics, run the numbers, and then figure out what to do and what it means in terms of their business strategy. That's where the board becomes relevant. The board then takes this analytics, works with management to then help them make their decisions to make their business strategies resilient in the face of these risks. Companies know how to do this. They just need to first recognize that these environmental and social issues also pose financial impacts.
All right. Sarah, let's talk money. Because I suspect if we were having this conversation 50 or 75 years ago, and we were talking about how boards pay their executives, we would note that, executives in companies make 5, 10, 15 times the average salary of one of their employees. Today, it is exponentially off the charts more that they are compensated. Does anything need to be done about that?
Well, we're in a terrible do loop when it comes to executive compensation, where we have gotten to the point where, companies feel that they need to compete with each other for the top talent. And so we get this escalation of pay, and then different CEOs benchmark themselves against their peers and say, well, I need to make at least as much as that person. And in fact, the boards, in order to make sure that they're doing their fiduciary duty, often will hire a compensation consultant to help them with, developing CEO pay, but they very rarely then look at the advice from the compensation consultant and say, we're going to take the lowest pay at the bottom of the average of the peers. It's usually at the middle or higher. And what that means is we're getting this, there's a process now in terms of how boards determine CEO compensation and therefore executive compensation more broadly, that's leading to this escalation and to this massive disconnect between the pay of the CEO and the pay of the workers who are actually doing the work in the company. So we have a broken system, but there's not a very easy answer to figuring out how we fix the broken system because of the quote, war for talent for senior leadership.
Yeah, Veena, do you think it's really the case that an executive can be so important to the future success of a company that they need to make $50, $75, $100 million a year?
I think a part of the problem, Steve, is exactly the problem that Sarah articulated, that executive compensation systems are so complex, so extraordinarily detail-oriented that the board compensation committee usually doesn't deal with the details themselves. This is outsourced to a compensation consultant. And this is one of the few issues where boards can't or should not be relying on management. So I think you do end up in a situation where directors rely a lot on compensation consultants who are being paid by the company. And I think, you end up with a situation that Sarah, I think very articulately called a broken system where executives are paid extraordinary amounts.
Well, let's get to the overarching question here, which is if there are problems that you have described during the course of our conversation, and of course, Sarah, in your report, how do we want to solve them? And one option that some people say is governments need to get in there and legislate. They need to legislate quotas for boards. They need to legislate salary caps, for example, on executives. What's your view on whether that is an advisable thing to do?
Well, I would say that, legislation is one tool, and I think it can be important in certain places. However, we also know that the companies that, for example, are, traded on the TSX are very diverse. Some are quite small, some are much larger. And one of the reasons that Peter Day and I, in our report, 360 Governance, suggested that these are, well, of course, we're not legislators, so we can't tell companies to do these things, but we believe this guideline process might be better because of the very different situations that companies are in. So what I hope is that companies are going to adopt these things. But of course, even when we've had legislation, for example, or regulation, the Ontario Securities Commission has comply or explain for having companies report on the number of women on their boards. And over 5 years, we've seen very little progress and improvement. And only about a third of companies even set targets at all for achievement, whatever the target is. And so if companies don't adopt these things, then I think we need to move to more regulation. But I think we just have to be careful that regulation doesn't become something that, or legislation doesn't become something that just makes companies do things in a rote way, as opposed to using the information in the ways that Veena is describing to actually inform their business strategy.
Veena, how about you on that?
I think what we've seen in the US is a tremendous amount of action motivated by investor pressure. So, here's a really cool example. So Ceres, along with a number of groups, helps organize a process called the CA 100 Plus Initiative. It's the Climate Action 100 Plus Initiative, which brings together close to 500 global investors representing, $30-40 trillion in assets. And these are investors who are collectively engaging some of the most carbon-intensive companies in the world on their governance approach to climate change, including the approach taken by their board of directors. So we've seen, as a result of investor engagement, investor dialogue, a lot of companies start to set goals, start to, put systems at place at the board level to really systematize their oversight of issues like climate change, and also start to make linkages between executive compensation and climate change. So I think investor power, investor engagement can also get us a lot of the way we need to go.
Well, let's finish up on this, Sarah. If corporations do not see it as their own enlightened self-interest to be more inclusive in their appointments to boards of directors, do you think at the end of the day, governments need to get in there and legislate them to do it?
Well, yes. On a personal note, I'm a big fan of quotas. We've seen them work in other parts of the world, and people say, oh, we don't want quotas, or we might not even want targets because, you know, that argument that we talked about before, where would we find the women or the people of color, people with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ community, indigenous people? They make this argument that there wouldn't be enough quality people. And we know from research on areas where quotas have been put in place that it actually increases the quality. It increases the effectiveness of boards because they have different lived experiences that allow them to consider these issues that we're talking about. So I'm not afraid of quotas at all. I can't tell companies to put quotas in place, but I think every company should be setting a target and reporting on that at least. And I personally believe that we may, if we don't see progress soon, we may need to move in the direction of quotas.
To be continued. Sarah Kaplan from the Rotman School of Management at U of T, Veena Ramani from Ceres in Boston. It's great to have both of you with us tonight on TVO. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, March the 10th, 2021. In an alternative timeline, this week would have been March break. Tomorrow, Nam Kiwanuka gets some perspective and advice from parenting pros on getting through this last leg of the school year. Also, we'll find out about doctor burnout and how physicians before, during, and after this crisis need to take care of themselves as well. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. And we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.